In the spring of 1863, along the bayous of southern Louisiana, a wealthy cotton planter named Colonel Marcus Delacroix entered into an arrangement so morally grotesque that it would ultimately destroy not only his family's legacy, but also cast a shadow over an entire parish for generations to come. What began as a desperate attempt to secure an heir through the most dehumanizing exploitation of enslaved human beings ended in madness, violence, and a tragedy that even the Confederate elite who surrounded him could not ignore or forgive. You are watching Shadows of the South, where we unearth the most disturbing and forgotten stories of the slave-holding South, tales that reveal the true cost of a system built on the ownership of human souls. The Delacroix plantation, known locally as Bel Ombre, sprawled across nearly 2,000 acres of fertile land where the Mississippi River deposits its rich sediment into the delta. 370 enslaved men, women, and children worked the cotton fields from dawn until the stars emerged, their labor generating wealth that placed Colonel Delacroix among the most prominent planters in St. Mary Parish. The main house stood 3 stories tall, its white columns gleaming in the humid Louisiana sun, surrounded by ancient live oaks draped in Spanish moss that seemed to absorb the very secrets whispered beneath their branches. The colonel himself was 47 years old in that fateful year, a graduate of West Point who had resigned his commission to inherit his father's empire, a man whose education and military bearing gave him an air of authority that few in the parish would dare question. He wore his graying hair, swept back from a high forehead, kept his beard trimmed in the military fashion, and spoke with the cultured accent of New Orleans aristocracy, tempered by years of commanding both soldiers and enslaved laborers. His wife, Celestin Delacroix, was 29 years old, nearly 2 decades his junior, the daughter of a prominent Charleston merchant who had married into Louisiana society with all the grace and breeding expected of a Southern lady. She had been raised on French literature, piano recitals, and the unspoken understanding that a woman's primary duty was to provide her husband with legitimate heirs who would carry forward the family name and fortune. Celestin was slender and pale, with dark auburn hair that she wore in elaborate arrangements and gray eyes that seemed to grow more distant with each passing year. She supervised the house slaves with efficiency, attended church every Sunday at St. Michael's Episcopal, and maintained all the outward appearances of genteel plantation life. But after 8 years of marriage, her womb remained empty, and this failure hung over Bel Ombre like the humidity that preceded a storm. The colonel had consulted physicians in New Orleans and even corresponded with a doctor in Charleston who specialized in matters of fertility. Various tonics, treatments, and rituals had been attempted, all to no avail. The medical men suggested that the problem might lie with the lady herself, though such diagnoses were always delivered with delicacy and circumspection. As the war raged across Virginia and Tennessee, as Confederate fortunes wavered and the institution of slavery itself faced an uncertain future, the pressure to secure the Delacroix legacy became an obsession that consumed the colonel's thoughts day and night. He had built an empire, but without a son to inherit it, what meaning did any of it possess? The neighboring plantations were already whispering, already wondering who would claim Bel Ombre when the colonel passed, already circulating names of distant cousins and calculating their chances. It was during the winter of 1862, in the weeks following Christmas, that Colonel Delacroix conceived of his arrangement. He had been drinking brandy in his study, surrounded by leather-bound books and military memorabilia, when the idea first took shape in his fevered imagination. If the physicians believed his wife incapable of conception, and if he himself had sired no children despite his vigor, perhaps the problem lay not in her body, but in some mysterious incompatibility between them. But what if another man's seed could quicken where his own could not? The thought was monstrous, but in his mind it was also logical, a solution that required only the proper implementation, and on a plantation where he owned every living soul beyond his own wife, implementation was merely a matter of command. The colonel spent weeks studying his enslaved workforce with new eyes, evaluating the men not as field hands or craftsmen, but as potential vessels for his grotesque experiment. He needed men who were strong, intelligent, and physically impressive, men whose offspring might plausibly pass as legitimate heirs if the scheme succeeded. He also needed men who were utterly under his control, men who would never dare speak of what they had been commanded to do, men who understood that their very lives depended on absolute silence. By February of 1863, he had made his selections, 4 enslaved men, each between the ages of 25 and 32, each chosen for specific attributes that the colonel had catalogued with the cold precision of a livestock breeder. The first was Samuel, 30 years old, the plantation blacksmith, a man of tremendous physical strength, whose skill with metal and fire made him invaluable to Bel Hombre's operations. Samuel stood well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and hands that could bend iron, yet he moved with surprising grace and spoke with an educated diction that suggested he had once known different circumstances before slavery. The second was Isaac, 28, the head carpenter, who supervised the construction and maintenance of all the plantation's buildings, a light-skinned man whose own parentage clearly included white ancestry, giving him features that the colonel deemed suitable for his purpose. The third was Benjamin, 27, who worked as the colonel's personal valet and coachman, a position that required intelligence, discretion, and the ability to move between the plantation's different social spheres without drawing attention. The fourth was Moses, 25, the youngest of the group, who served as overseer for one of the field gangs, a position of relative authority among the enslaved population that required both strength and the ability to command respect. Pause for a moment and reflect on what it meant that these 4 men, despite whatever skills or dignities they had managed to preserve within the horror of bondage, were about to be reduced to nothing more than instruments in their master's twisted scheme, their bodies and their very humanity sacrificed to the insatiable appetite of plantation patriarchy. In early March of 1863, as the cotton fields were being prepared for spring planting, Colonel Delacroix summoned the 4 men to his study separately, one by one, in the dead of night. To each, he explained the arrangement in terms that left no room for misunderstanding and no possibility of refusal. The man would be brought to the main house on specified nights and conducted to a particular room on the 2nd floor, where Mrs. Delacroix would be waiting. The encounter would take place in darkness and in silence. No words would be spoken, no names would be used. The man would perform his duty and then be escorted back to the quarters. If the lady conceived and bore a child, that child would be raised as the legitimate heir to Bel Hombre, and the 4 men would carry the secret to their graves. If they ever spoke of the arrangement to anyone, if they ever showed by word or gesture any acknowledgement of what had transpired, they would be sold south to the sugar plantations, where life expectancy was measured in years rather than decades, or worse, they would simply disappear into the swamps that surrounded the property, their bodies never to be found. The colonel made it clear that he viewed this not as violation, but as duty, not as sin but as necessity. He was offering them, he said, a peculiar kind of privilege, an intimacy with the plantation's lady that no slave could otherwise dream of, and in return he demanded only their silence and their seed. To Samuel, he emphasized the strength that would flow through any child they created. To Isaac, he spoke of the intelligence and refinement. To Benjamin, he mentioned the discretion and loyalty such a child would inherit. To Moses, he promised that the child would grow up with power and position that would honor the bloodline. Each man listened in the lamplight of the colonel's study, their faces carefully neutral, their responses limited to a single word, "Yes, sir." What the colonel never asked, and what these 4 men could never speak, was what they truly felt about being commanded to perform this act. Were they repulsed? Were they terrified of what might happen if they refused, or if they failed? Did they feel any anger at being transformed into breeding stock, or had slavery already taught them that their bodies were never their own? The historical record, such as it exists, offers no answers to these questions. We know only that they obeyed, because in the world of Bel Hombre plantation in 1863, enslaved people had no power to do otherwise. Mrs. Celestine Delacroix was informed of the arrangement by her husband on a Tuesday evening after supper, in the privacy of their bedroom. The colonel presented it not as a question, but as a decision already made, a solution to their childlessness that required her cooperation. According to a letter that would later be discovered among her personal effects, Celestine's initial response was one of horror and disbelief. She protested that such an arrangement was an abomination before God, a violation of every principle of Christian marriage and Southern honor. The colonel countered with arguments about biblical precedent, about Abraham and Sarah and Hagar, about the sacred duty to preserve the family line, about the looming war and the uncertain future they faced. He insisted that the children born of this arrangement would be legally hers, raised as Delacroix heirs, and that no one beyond the participants would ever know the truth. The argument raged for hours, then days, then weeks. The colonel threatened, cajoled, and finally broke his wife's resistance through sheer persistence and the psychological weight of her subordinate position within the marriage. By the end of March, Celestine had reluctantly, desperately agreed, perhaps believing that no conception would actually occur, perhaps hoping that God would intervene to prevent such a monstrous violation of natural law. She requested only that the encounters take place in complete darkness, that no words be spoken, and that she never know which of the four men was present on any given night. The colonel agreed to these terms, seeing them as reasonable precautions that would preserve the psychological fiction that his wife was somehow not fully complicit in her own defilement. The arrangement began on the first Monday of April 1863, during a week when the cotton plants were just beginning to emerge from the rich delta soil. The colonel established a rotating schedule that he alone maintained, bringing one of the four enslaved men to the main house each Monday and Thursday evening. The house slaves who worked in the main residence were given strict instructions to remain in their quarters after nightfall, and a trusted older woman named Ruth, who had served the Delacroix family for 40 years, was assigned the task of preparing the designated room and escorting the men in darkness from a side entrance to the second floor and back again. Ruth performed this duty with the same silent efficiency with which she performed all her other tasks, her face revealing nothing, her tongue held in check by decades of survival in a world where speaking truth could mean death. If you wish to continue hearing these forgotten stories of the antebellum South, stories that reveal the true moral cost of the slave system, please consider subscribing to Shadows of the South. These are histories that demand to be remembered, no matter how painful they may be. As spring turned to summer in 1863, the arrangement continued with mechanical regularity, twice each week, the four men rotating according to the colonel's private schedule. The household at Bel Ombre took on a strange, terrible quality during this period, as if everyone within its walls was holding their breath, waiting for something to break. The field slaves sensed that something was wrong in the big house, but could not name what it was. The house slaves who had been banished to their quarters after dark knew more but spoke less. Mrs. Delacroix grew increasingly pale and withdrawn, taking her meals alone in her room, and avoiding social calls from neighboring plantations. The colonel threw himself into the business of cotton cultivation with manic energy, spending long days in the fields and evenings poring over account books, perhaps trying to outrun his own conscience. The four enslaved men at the center of this horror each responded differently to their ongoing violation. Samuel the blacksmith began to work longer hours at his forge, hammering iron with such fury that the other slaves whispered he was trying to beat the devil out of the metal. Isaac the carpenter became increasingly silent, speaking only when directly addressed, his skilled hands continuing to build and repair, but his eyes growing hollow. Benjamin the valet maintained his careful composure in the colonel's presence, but was seen by others walking the edges of the plantation at night, staring out toward the swamps as if contemplating flight. Moses the overseer became harder and more distant with the field hands under his supervision, as if the authority he wielded over others was the only power left to him in a world where he himself was utterly powerless. In a society where even love was property, where intimacy itself could be commanded and bodies deployed like tools, is it any wonder that madness seemed inevitable? The institution of slavery corrupted not only the relationship between master and slave, but poisoned every human connection it touched, transforming marriage into strategic alliance, reproduction into commercial transaction, and desire itself into an instrument of power and control. By July, Mrs. Celestine Delacroix suspected that she might be pregnant. The signs were subtle at first: a missed monthly course, a certain tenderness in her breasts, a persistent nausea that arrived with the morning humidity. She confided her suspicions to Ruth, who prepared certain herbal tonics meant to ease early pregnancy, and watched over the young mistress with sorrowful eyes that had seen too much over too many years. When Celestine finally informed her husband of her condition in late July, the colonel's reaction was one of triumph so intense that it bordered on mania. He immediately ended the arrangement with the 4 enslaved men, sending each a terse message through Benjamin. "Your services are no longer required." The rotating schedule ceased, and the designated room on the second floor was locked and never used again. The colonel began to plan elaborate renovations to the nursery, ordering imported furniture from New Orleans and wallpaper from France despite the wartime blockade. He spoke openly now of his coming heir, accepting congratulations from neighboring planters who assumed the pregnancy was the natural result of his marriage, and who would never suspect the grotesque truth. He attended church services with renewed piety, thanking God for finally blessing his household with the promise of a child. Mrs. Delacroix, meanwhile, retreated further into herself, spending her days in her room with the curtains drawn, refusing to discuss the pregnancy beyond confirming its existence, her hands resting protectively over her growing belly, as if she could somehow shield the child within from the circumstances of its conception. But secrets of this magnitude cannot remain buried forever, particularly not in the closed world of a plantation where every gesture is observed, every whisper noted, every deviation from normal routine catalogued and discussed. The first crack in the colonel's carefully constructed fiction appeared in late August, when one of the field hands, a woman named Dinah who worked in the kitchen garden, mentioned to another slave that she had seen Samuel entering the big house through a side door late at night on several occasions in the spring. The second slave told another, and soon the story was spreading through the quarters like kudzu, mutating and expanding with each retelling. By September, virtually every enslaved person on Belle Ombre knew or suspected that something inappropriate had occurred between the lady of the house and certain enslaved men, though the details remained unclear and the full scope of the colonel's arrangement was not yet understood. The rumors eventually reached the ears of other white people in the parish through the invisible network of communication that connected enslaved populations across plantation boundaries. A house slave from a neighboring property heard the story while visiting Belle Ombre to deliver a message. That slave mentioned it to her mistress, who in turn whispered it to her husband, who raised the matter with another planter over cigars and whiskey. By October of 1863, as Mrs. Delacroix entered her second trimester and her condition became visibly obvious, whispers were circulating among the white elite of St. Mary Parish that something scandalous had occurred at Belle Ombre, though no one yet dared speak the accusations openly in the colonel's presence. The social pressure mounted gradually but inexorably. Invitations to Belle Ombre, once eagerly accepted by the parish's elite families, began to be declined with transparent excuses. Mrs. Delacroix's name was quietly omitted from the Ladies' Auxiliary Committee at St. Michael's Episcopal. The colonel found himself excluded from a meeting of local planters to discuss Confederate requisition policies, a deliberate snub that he could not fail to notice. When he confronted one of his neighbors about the growing coldness, the man replied with careful words that nevertheless carried clear meaning. "People are talking, Marcus. You should attend to your household's reputation before it is too late." Enraged and desperate to control the narrative, Colonel Delacroix summoned the 4 enslaved men to his study once more in early November. This meeting bore no resemblance to the careful instructions he had delivered in March. Instead, he raged at them, demanding to know who had spoken, who had broken the silence, who had betrayed the arrangement. The men stood before him in genuine confusion, each protesting truthfully that he had said nothing to anyone, each understanding that the colonel was looking for someone to blame for a situation that was spinning beyond his control. When no confession was forthcoming, the colonel's fury turned to threats. He would sell them, he shouted. He would have them whipped until the skin fell from their backs. He would see them dead before he allowed them to destroy his family's honor. Pause and consider the supreme irony of a man who had orchestrated the systematic violation of 4 human beings and his own wife, who had treated marriage and reproduction as a commercial transaction no different from the buying and selling of cotton. Now speaking of honor, as if the word retained any meaning at all in the moral wasteland he had created. The breaking point came in December of 1863. During the preparations for Christmas celebrations at Belle Ombre, Miss Celestine Delacroix, now 7 months pregnant and confined mostly to her room, began to exhibit signs of what the physicians would later describe as melancholia or nervous collapse. She stopped eating regularly, lost interest in the nursery preparations, and spent long hours staring out her window at the moss-draped oaks, murmuring words that Ruth could not quite hear. The baby moved within her, a constant reminder of her condition, and with each movement she seemed to retreat further into some interior darkness that no one could reach. When her husband came to visit, she turned her face to the wall and would not speak. When Ruth brought food, she pushed it away untouched. When the minister from St. Michael's arrived to offer spiritual counsel, she laughed with a sound that contained no humor whatsoever, a brittle, broken noise that frightened everyone who heard it. On the evening of December 23rd, Mrs. Celestine Delacroix told Ruth that she wanted to speak with the 4 men who had been brought to her room in the spring, that she needed to apologize to them before the child was born. Yet she could not bear to bring a baby into the world, while carrying the weight of what had been done to them in darkness and silence. Ruth, understanding the danger of such a meeting, but unable to refuse her mistress's increasingly frantic pleas, reluctantly agreed to convey the message. She approached Samuel first, then Isaac, then Benjamin, then Moses, asking each if he would be willing to come to the main house that night to receive an apology from the lady. The men's reactions varied from confusion to suspicion to resignation, but in the end, all 4 agreed, perhaps recognizing that this strange request offered the only opportunity they would ever have to speak openly about what had been done to them. They gathered in the parlor of the main house shortly after midnight on Christmas Eve, an unprecedented assembly that violated every social and racial boundary of the antebellum South. Mrs. Delacroix descended the stairs wearing a white nightgown, her pregnant belly visible beneath the thin fabric, her hair loose around her shoulders, her face pale as bone in the lamplight. Ruth stood in the doorway, uncertain whether to remain or flee, her hands twisted in her apron. The 4 men stood awkwardly, their eyes downcast, none of them knowing what to expect or how to respond to this surreal situation. Mrs. Delacroix spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly in the silent room. She told them that she was sorry, that she had been wrong to participate in her husband's scheme, that she had treated them as instruments rather than as human beings with their own thoughts and feelings and dignity. She acknowledged that she had been complicit in their violation, that her own suffering did not excuse her cooperation, that she would carry the guilt of what she had done for the rest of her life. She asked if they could possibly forgive her, though she knew she had no right to request forgiveness for something so monstrous. The men stood in stunned silence for a long moment. Then Samuel, the blacksmith, spoke in his deep, careful voice. He said that he did not know if he could forgive, that forgiveness was a word that assumed choice and agency, that he had never possessed, but that he acknowledged her apology, and understood that she too had been trapped in a system that degraded everyone it touched. Isaac added quietly
that the child she carried was innocent of all their sins and deserved a chance at life, that perhaps some good could still emerge from this tragedy if she raised the baby with kindness and taught it to be different from its fathers and mothers. Benjamin said nothing, only nodded once, his face unreadable. Moses turned toward the door as if to leave, then stopped and spoke words that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. "Ain't none of us gonna see how this ends. Something's coming. I can feel it in my bones." What none of them knew was that Colonel Marcus Delacroix had returned early from a trip to New Orleans and had entered the house through a side door, drawn by the unusual light in the parlor. He stood in the shadows of the hallway, listening to his wife's confession and the enslaved men's responses, his face contorting with rage and shame, and something darker than either emotion. When Moses finished speaking and turned toward the door, the colonel stepped into the lamplight, a pistol in his right hand, his eyes wild with an emotion beyond rational thought. The tragedy that followed unfolded with terrible speed. The colonel accused his wife of infidelity, of falling in love with her rapists, of planning to run away with them and abandon him to social ruin. He pointed the pistol at Samuel, then at Isaac, then at Benjamin, then at Moses, his hand shaking so violently that it seemed impossible he could aim. Mrs. Delacroix screamed and threw herself between the men and her husband, begging him to put down the weapon, insisting that nothing inappropriate had occurred beyond her own apology for past wrongs. Ruth rushed forward to pull her mistress back, terrified that the pregnant woman would be struck by a stray bullet. The 4 enslaved men froze, knowing that any movement might be interpreted as aggression and trigger a massacre. Reflect for a moment on how the institution of slavery transformed human beings into property and property into instruments of a patriarch's will, creating a moral universe so twisted that a man could believe he was acting rationally while orchestrating the violation of his own wife and 4 human beings he claimed to own. Consider how this system destroyed everyone it touched: the enslaved men used as breeding stock, the white woman reduced to a vessel for another man's seed, the master himself driven to murder and suicide by his own scheme, and the innocent child who never had a chance to live. This is the true legacy of slavery, not just physical bondage, but the complete corruption of human relationships, the transformation of love into power and power into death. The story of Bel Ombre and Colonel Marcus Delacroix remained largely forgotten outside of local Louisiana folklore until the mid-20th century, when historians examining plantation records and slave narratives began to piece together the truth of what had happened in 1863. The tale is disturbing precisely because it is not unique. Plantation records across the South document countless cases of enslaved people forced into sexual relationships at their master's command, women and men alike, used as breeding stock, or forced to satisfy the desires of white owners who faced no legal consequences for their actions. What makes the Delacroix case particularly tragic is that it was the master himself who orchestrated the violation of his own wife, creating a spiral of degradation that consumed everyone involved, and left no survivors to tell the tale except those whose testimony was systematically dismissed and ignored for generations. These stories reveal the price of power unchecked by basic human decency, the cost of a social system that defines some people as fully human and others as property to be used and discarded at will. The institution of slavery did not simply exploit black labor for white profit, it corrupted the very concept of human relationship, transforming intimate connections into transactions, love into ownership, reproduction into commerce. It destroyed families, black and white alike, and left a legacy of trauma that echoes down through the generations even now. More than a century and a half after emancipation, the South preferred to forget these stories, to bury them beneath myths of gracious plantation life and noble lost causes. But history demands that we remember, that we bear witness to what was done, and that we acknowledge the full moral catastrophe of a system that treated human beings as things. If these forgotten histories of the antebellum South have moved you, If you believe that even the darkest chapters of our past deserve to be remembered and confronted honestly, I invite you to share your reflections in the comments below. How do we reckon with a past this painful? How do we honor the memory of those who suffered in silence, whose stories were deliberately erased or distorted? The legacy of slavery continues to shape our world in profound ways, and only by facing its true horror can we hope to build something better on the ruins it left behind.